Alright, I'm going to Session Tempe de la Caricina to do same day, Yomo Choso, Yomo Yu Lipa, Dia the Gaja Sungji, and the same day Kiwi, Keolpa, some Dasha or Restes, a Dusin Tempe, and Chikiwi, some Dasha or Restes. The names are done to some Dadukala, Nakarasene, Tangan Sangi, Tanju Simba, Sadi, Che Tamche. The dog or king or Sange and Jensen simply by Kim Biggie, Chaka, Mares, and do that number condo king or S, and my Kimba mess. The names that Kimba in Zata, Denegi, and those king or S at that Sangi, Sange that Jensen, but Kim Biggie in there, and do that number condo, Simjelia, Simjing, Dundruyalma, Simje Duase, and Digi Duyal Parkidina, Simjel. Le Sisha Duchin, Sugar S and Big Duchin. And then Sangi that you simply can't say you see in dedicate to sit. Dinner, Sosorang, and the Kawa Yoresaneta, Sangi that you simply Tonsegi, me Tonsegi, Dundelia, some big Gedina, and Dapper, Nick Sangi that you simply Dundele, some big Gedina, Sangi that you simply Masido Yores and big do some down chorus. Those in some time. Dine, and Sosugi, Jezada, Sosugi, some deep roach, deepata, Denegi, deep lega, Jeba inada, Sanjay, Denegi, Jeba inada, Sosugi, me, Chige, Sanjil, Kalamazibitus, Lega Jebena, and Digo Maratine, Zangi, and Chige, Divasa, Dipigi, and Tivasa, and Setelin, and Chige. Yomo get Setin and Rai, Makiva Shamiki, Rajan, Nigala, Makiva Chagore, Jezada. Denegi Kiwa Chimay and Liang and Basabi, Wangi, Tanga Kiwa Chimay and Tiba, Casa, Duhanyonga Chagri, Sambigi, Denedin, Duchin, Sosugi, Sosol, some Tanche, that Denegi, and Chiki, Tibi Chawa said, Zawin Chime, Sambig Luchin, some Tempati and the chair. On the Tating was a Shavasi or Duchin, Rangi Kimsen the Chine, and Tipa Zemba de la Dan was a Shavas, on to some Taje. Deneam. On that Denegi, that the gene, Rang Gidina, Sanjana, Jensen Big Dundel, Tonsel, Shudeba, and Edinegi, Migiwe, Sim, Yomobe, Ondo Sanji Migiwe, Java, Lega Cheveneta, that's Sanjeda, Jensen Macala, Miziba Charu, just Sanjeda, Jensen, 2 Yig Marasembi, Dushin, Sanja Gata, Gawa, Pagortining, Yabu Marasembi, Dushin, some diet. Dimin Big that in a Shangi Toma and Sosolia, and Chiki. Me Shangi Oda got the Dinichi Kataya, Gyunju, Yu Charu, some Shanle Dene, then sometimes Suzuki Kiwi, Chicken Tipa Chigme, some Bedushin, Jambatenje, Zemgores, Chizan Dinegi, Javaina, that Tiba Javaina, Dilesa, Tiongain, Duanyong, Dushmores, and Dinegida, Shan Sanget and Jusemba, the Shanle Dene, Nangy, Sosarangi, Tiba Zemba, that Chayo Baj. Or do some was a church into Shigores, do some budget, that seemed the Pitina, Jambateja Kiria, seemed the Keol Kanya, Shatubachi or as kissing us that it in issues.
Good evening. So to review what we looked at last week, which you looked at two verses within the overall chapter on vigilance as well as mindfulness. And then these verses presented further techniques by which to encourage us to rely on both mindfulness and vigilance, these two indispensable minds which are required to keep our mindfulness, to keep abiding on virtuous ways of thinking, and our vigilance standing on guard, ever alert for the possible arisal of afflictions. So these two indispensable minds bring about the cultivation of virtuous ways of thinking and prevent the arisal of afflictions. So the verses we looked at last week continued within the general presentation of pointing out the great importance of mindfulness and vigilance, and giving guidance on how to rely, how to have mindfulness and vigilance stable. So not sporadic, but stable. So in the 31st verse, we saw last week that the Buddhas with their omniscient consciousnesses and the Bodhisattvas with their powerful clairvoyance, for them, they are always knowing, they know all phenomena. So for the Buddhas with omniscient consciousness, there is nothing that is hidden from them. And for Bodhisattvas, with a bit of effort, their consciousness can abide amongst us too. So through recognizing this, we realize that we are always actually in their presence. We may not be able to perceive them physically, but because of their omniscience and clairvoyance, they can perceive us. So this then, we utilize this recognition both to lift us up, to recognize that we have their support, we have their companionship, we have their encouragement by being in their presence, being amongst them at all times. And we can utilize this understanding to encourage us to act appropriately, as if one were physically amongst Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. How would one act at such a time? That is then how one should act at all times. In particular, what it comes down to is using mindfulness and vigilance to ensure that the mind is at all times wholesome and not under the influence of the afflictions. Thereby, with a wholesome mind, one's physical behavior, one's verbal speech, this will be wholesome too. So this was the one technique we looked at last week. And then we saw, following from that then in the 32nd verse, that from this, qualities such as shame arises. So shame, in the Buddhist context, is a virtuous mind, because shame arises before one engages in potential non-virtuous behavior. Shame is the virtuous mind that serves to encourage our restraint from unethical behavior, recognizing that such physical behavior or speech or way of thinking is inappropriate. I am someone who has committed to become a bodhisattva myself, to join the ranks of the bodhisattvas. This way of thinking, this way of acting is inappropriate. And in this way, shame is a virtuous mind that serves to encourage our restraint from inappropriate behavior. Thereafter, we also saw the mind of fear can act also in a restraining capacity. So by fear, then recognizing fear arises through mindfulness, recalling the many faults of the afflictions, and thereby encouraging us to remain on virtuous, wholesome ways of thinking. Because being mindful of the faults of the afflictions, one knows one will suffer. Not wanting to suffer, fear for suffering arises and encourages us to refrain from the afflictions and stay on virtuous ways of thinking. And thirdly, respect too arises. Knowing we're in the presence of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, respect for these great beings with such capacity arises within us. And this too then is a virtuous mind that encourages us to be mindful of being in the company of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and thereby to have our mind appropriate, and thereby, in other words, non-afflicted, and thereby our speech and physical behavior also being wholesome.
Denege dushine sanje da ju sembe yende ten ju dushine yende temba ten do jesa dene zada sanje chisu tembe jeten se de chagor yongor yese sanje chisu tembe jeten denege da ten ju so so mosa jia da chye jene semde gewala yang du chen yang ne sha de dushine sha yang de dene jige temba dushine dene temba tembu chagor yese ro da temba semde gewala ne shi tembe gewa ten shi be ten du kan temba dushine tembu chagor yese yang da yang do jung se de dene temba chagor yese da de temba ge han de dene yese kesin du shiro.
And the 32nd verse, which was the second that we looked at last week, concluded with, through this process, or the result of this process of being aware or recalling, so being mindful or recalling, that one is really at all times in the presence of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, amongst the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, this joyful mind of recognizing that, of being mindful that we are in their presence, this leads to virtuous minds such as shame, as well as fear and respect arising. And from this, our mindfulness becomes stable. So yes, from this then, our mindfulness becomes stable. So.
Yes, sir. All right. On the day that Jinang was said, kissing and kissing Sarah the some Sidadang and Gabrilia, Jikin Biggie. That was a city, Jubang and Jelia, and Tibicha Cheval Zemba, Marunga, Java, Marunga, Java, Zemba, Chigmes, and some notilla, Zim, some Mosalwa, Giawachagurwa. Tina, Dini Zadang to Gabrielia, Ajike, Michigate. God and Zunshin, a good Zunshes on Mosa, like your water, Chichisan, didn't Mosa, says Lagur water. She's not that didn't love you to Donda, Car something was in Mosa, lady, go Motsa Yomar water. She's not the only Kuron Motsa Gorte, Kuron Motsa Kiamason said go water. A Mosa lady, the collega Dujaba, the Motsawa Marida in you. Motsawa Marida. Dangazu Goyala, the Lega Dujaba, the Goya Nyadua, collega Zunshi, a cure Motsa Zunshes on Labde, Tisan Colu. Zunshieva the Mosa said the Goyag and Yangadua. Then Dimare that Zunshi and Mosa allowing to Mosa Ki or the Mosa Kimas on Mosa Maja Zunshes said the Kuhorda.
Whilst we did speak about shame last week, it's worthwhile to repeat and further look at this term, because its meaning in Buddhism is quite different from how it is used in society. Because shame and its companion, embarrassment, both of these are seen as virtuous minds. But the way the words are used in society are quite different, and therefore people can be surprised to hear that these are seen as excellent minds to cultivate or to have within oneself. So in the Buddhist context, shame arises before one engages in non-virtuous behavior, and thereby serves to encourage restraint by reminding oneself, if I were to do that, it would be shameful. So in this way, we see shame arising before one does something or says something. Whereas in society, we tend to use shame after the event. So someone else will say, what you did was shameful, or what you said was shameful. So this is referring to something already done, which is after the fact. Whereas the meaning in Buddhism is that shame is a mind that arises before one engages in something inappropriate, and thereby serves to encourage restraint. But in society, if we say to someone, what you did or what you said was shameful, this is referring to something already done. So if we were to talk in a Dharma way in society, then the way we would express this, when you did that, shame did not arise beforehand. We were not restrained by recognizing that would have been shameful. So this would be the way that we would speak in society if we were talking in accordance with the meaning of, as in the Dharma, which is that shame and its companion embarrassments arise before one engages in the non-virtuous deed, and thereby serves to restrain one. If we say to someone or think to ourselves, oh, what was done, what I did, what they did was shameful, really, from the Dharma perspective, one could say, well, that's an abbreviation to say that was shameful. Because the fuller expression would be, shame did not arise. Because again, shame arises before one engages in non-virtue. So when one says, oh, that was shameful, what one is really saying, from the Dharma perspective, shame did not arise.
Atisha. That in the Jamba Timba in the Jamba Tin, Shishin the King, kissing that Jamba Timba, Jambi soon begin the Shishin Getans, the Canadians, and that they ma King says she had it that in my share. Gansi Jamba Yigone, soon we do near Europa. They say Shishin, one Euroshin, somewhat Tajan, somewhat more Euros.
Continuing to look at these two minds of mindfulness and vigilance, we come to the 33rd verse. When mindfulness remains for the purpose of protecting the doorways to the mind, it is then that vigilance returns, and whenever it goes once more, it reappears again.
Onda Gangse Jembe Yigo ne Sunwe Dun ne Gyurba Sidi Dashizada, Gangse Sidi Deji Gang Shubana Jang Jugi, the Negi, and the Rang Kumsen Cheche, and the Mosache, and Shen Jusujine, and the Che, and Mache Che Sem that Jembati Sim Kewalpa Shache, Du Shekewarang, some Dutch Lucy, the Yana, the Nayana and the Dutch Sharandu, Sem D and Yi Yukone Sungura City, Sem D that. Nyomo choso rohe nyomo ji yulpa mata jen and sungores yukone is in sem de pa mata ji sungores de dan sung de ne ge sung je and sem de ge wi duan da mi yu ge wa ji le mi je du se ne di go re ne gyurpas ne gyurpas ya de disi wa kan si jembe yi go ne sung wi duan ne gyurpas sem ne ge wa la us ne go re za da sem di yi temba du sen de yi gyumje rang gyumsen de chene ane nyomo chene ya bo mal samba an shen gyumsen de chene an de ne chige chöbang ba diba de ya bo mal sambe de ne gyumsen sam da che so ge sem de nyomo choso ma da wa che sem de ne gewal pa ne de da de ne ge diba chigi me chene ya bo chigi me sambe samma da rang gyumse chene diba chigi ma chigi me sambe samlo chen gyumse de chene diba chigi me sambe samlo de ne ge du jiba ching mewe sam dang yu sem di kewa kyang yal pa ne di wa tenpi du ching yu kewa kyang yal ne yu wa ne ba za sem di pa go chi lo ma dang wa na xin kang pe na la ju sha ba na xin sem di yi ji go chi ne sem nyong mo be ge wi cho de pa sha chen sem nyong mo cho dang go ma de ne sung go wa de sung wa za sem di kewa la pa ne di yu re se ge wi mi ba chi la du ne go re se sung ye de ne gyur ba.
As a translator, I didn't say so clearly in the previous segment. So here in the 33rd verse, the outline is how to generate vigilance from mindfulness. So now looking at the first two lines in the 33rd verse and coming to what Ken has just described. When mindfulness remains for the purpose of protecting the doorways to the mind. So this is now talking about when mindfulness is abiding on virtuous minds. So it's not, mindfulness isn't here just abiding on virtuous minds, but it is, because mindfulness has this, its synonyms of mindfulness or recollection and memory. So mindfulness is also recalling the benefit of keeping the mind virtuous and the grave faults and dangers of the afflictions. So in this way, mindfulness is keeping itself on virtuous ways of thinking. So when mindfulness remains for the purpose of protecting the doorways to the mind. So mindfulness is keeping the mind focused on virtuous objects and encouraging the mind to remain virtuous by both reminding one of the benefits of keeping the mind virtuous and the faults of following the afflictions.
Nyomo be choso nyomo ke yulpa ka che semne ke mi ba lu che change du ne de yinza da semne ke wal pa ne de res za de ne de ba di ne kap so da chen de che xi jin wong se de xi jin de yores nyom de yores or da ka sen de ne ke chen ba de yu ke wa chil pa ne she de di ne kap so da ngazu semdi ta nyomo be choso dugu duye mindu de kanin gewe shu ne duye ne du mindu sembege da du ken xie de yonggo re se de se xi ji hong se de da jamba sun jembi gi sem nyomo choso song no de da xie xin gi go re se wo da xie xin gi go re se.
So whilst mindfulness is serving this function of recalling the faults of deflections, the benefits of remaining on virtue, the third line is then that vigilance returns. So vigilance arises, and vigilance then is acting then in a supporting way. So from this we see how vigilance arises from mindfulness.
Combaciado de Cambate, Jagores, and Betembetti, Telegamara, and some Ligua, how a Lamsani is the my long boy in the Massa, she said some Gamba Desures and some time, 10 Tinu, and then by the Sadugures and some Ligor. She said, is that Dara Nehores and Bede, Yashures and some Ligor, what is the Shishin de Lamsan court, Yamdur, she letting us of Chagore.
So this is likened to if one is walking along a narrow but steep precipice, where with each step you have to take great care. So at such a time you'll be very mindful, because you're going to be sure that, okay, this foot is down now securely, now I can move the next one, and I need to move it in a particular way so as not to slip down this ravine. So in this way, one is being very mindful of one's steps, and then vigilance will also arise, ensuring that one doesn't wander off to other thoughts while one is needing to remain focused on what is of utmost importance.
Jambadi Yane, Yandu Dushine, give some pa Yane and the Shar Dushe, change, and to stay on the Shishin de Pa Leungores, says a Duce Yane and the Shayandu, and the Dushine Nigores. That Gabriel Madame Bada de Nigi, Cheson or Yungures. Ina desu Gabriel Cheson by the Namsan, that Yaman de Nigi Yane and the Gombi Yingi, Namsan Jambadi and just to change the Namsa and get Namsa Sutugres or so on that homework curiosity. Gabriel on Jamba Shishiniga, Gabriel, ya, the nigger Yudi Madamba, that is Shishin Yudi Mad, Shishin de Pashika Warwa. She said the nail the Yamson by Gabriel Yamson, what that Gabriel was Jamna Yanks and the test Yamson or Yungura. In a Lamsa, that young get a sweet Jamba Shizili on Resident. Niga.
In the final line, whenever it goes once more, it reappears again. So the it here refers to both mindfulness and vigilance, in that if either were to go, it would return. So in other words, that whilst one is utilizing mindfulness and vigilance, being mindful of virtuous objects, but also being aware of the faults of the afflictions, and vigilance standing on guard, if either one is lost, it will, because of the presence of the other, arise again.
Gabriel Sosuge, Chikilad, Geshamor, Otenis, yours, and Bedena, or what? They go so that she in that Tembeniga, you never the Majavachipa, Sosuke, Chikicha, you Shandaji, Yanson, or what? Chesa, Denis, or the Lamsa, or the Yanson, and bigger, she's in how go on the Lamsa Jambegi, Tianja, or that teaching had some dash at the Lamsa to Yungor, Dina, she done Java Cardina, Diana Yadu, Gawatilla, Jawatlo, Combaina. She Gabriel Sarging is Tinigi, Java, Sona, Lamsa, Yajad, Jam or that the music commission, Jason, and Madame Bade, J. Choose a more sure that Nimama would imagine by that in Ungor, what Lendi Shaba Session de Gazi de Karina Menagaji Tagaji Semne Guina de Karina Menagaji City Marina, Tondala, Senior Combegalami, but Pai Yang du Chanso Lamsa, or the Yansons be Tempiki, Dika to Chukspa Yang Rete, in Lamsa, Change, and the Aja how what in the Temper Tenje, utilization me but Yunguri.
What's being described here is not for the beginners who are utilizing or trying to become proficient in mindfulness and vigilance, but for someone who has a good habituation to relying on mindfulness and vigilance, that as soon as one is lacking, the other will serve to, in a sense, as a reminder of the need for the one that is now lacking to re-arise. So as an illustration, when one is progressing through the various stages of developing calm abiding, as one's mindfulness and vigilance are improving, one reaches a point that as soon as, for example, the mind is distracted, perhaps through some activity that one needs to be done, immediately mindfulness and vigilance, because they have been trained so well, bring the mind back and the meditation continues, and the distraction is only very brief. So this is what's being referred to here in our fourth line. Whenever it goes once more, it reappears again. Because our training in both mindfulness and vigilance now is quite good, as soon as one slackens, it quickly comes back because of the quality or the strength of our habituation.
Bendigo kala sedi kolo namye chaksen je kala mas nye le cheba chpu ne Gabriel ya ji de yan chene chopu ya je chene kala sa ko zo yong lo namsan odering chopu pu ma so pe sa so se bi samni han namsan te ha ji tian jian chopu ya yong lo adina chi de ji de ne nam yong zo ka dun ro che de ka dun nam chaksen je de Gabriel ya yan chene ya ji ka dun je de la ro so le de oding ge ka dun je la ja sam je yan ja pa den je an yan ja ka dun je yong lo adu shin be ti ro chi che ro de ne jen ba de le de ne ge and the moon majib and the moon chobon and jet temper de mer what deny the moon majib other jes on be that house on be lamsan janji kaleka chagirwa.
And where you may well have experience of this is, let's say, you're cooking a meal you're quite familiar with. So while you're cooking, you taste it, and immediately you know the taste is a bit off, and you know what's missing. So this is because you have a lot of experience with this particular dish. So just from merely tasting it, you'll know it's not quite how it should be, and I know what is missing. And you can add the right amount. Or a more pertinent illustration is if you've got daily commitments that you meditate on, and later in the day you think, hang on, something's not quite right. I think. And then immediately you know, yes, there's one still that I haven't done. And then it comes back to you, and you know that you have to then complete one of your commitments. And this comes about when you have a strong habituation to something. With a strong habituation, you quickly know when something isn't right, and you fix it.
And call a tarby targo and be some Ludiane, Yando Tawina, and the Garilia and Jig temperature Sunaya, Namsa Odangedi, some Damos on the Jenge, and the Aye, Dusin Die, Unguas or Ungoresa. Dina she down Jiggy, some jet amje, Devati temperature, Big Jamba Comia, the Ninja Community, Yane Yando Magombaina, Tame, Yane Yando Combana Gabrilia, the Nigit. Chicomia Nimichi class on or didn't it come at the house on Pesa on some assumption, Lamsan Tensia, Gomba the Ungure, Cesadine, Gomba Ungure, so what I so what you homework you said, Dushin, Tangan Yamlenche, Yane, Yado Yane, Chijaban, Gabriela temperatures on the Lamsan Tensia, Yadushin, temperature, and she intended to give Yamlenche, but Ungure or
where you may also have experiences if you're really applying yourself to develop a particular training within the graduated stages of training the mind to attain enlightenment. Let's say you're meditating a lot on the faults of samsara, and you have been for a while. When one is meditating on one topic, That will be your main topic in the meditation session, but you'll keep your mind on that topic as best you can between meditation sessions as well as you go about your daily business. And then when you're going about your daily business, there'll be a feeling of being a bit unsettled. And that's because your mind isn't where it's now habituated to. And you'll quickly recall what you're meditating on, the sufferings of samsara, and in that way, you'll perceive whatever you're engaging with from the perspective of what you're meditating on. Likewise, if you're applying yourself to develop love and compassion, developing the strong wish, may all beings abide in happiness, may all beings gain their freedom from suffering, then you've developed this well in meditation and you have been doing so for a while. Then when you're going about your other activities, you will perceive the world, you'll perceive all that arises in your mind through this lens of may all beings abide free of suffering in lasting happiness. And if that is not present in your mind, again, the sense of unease will serve to call it back. Your mindfulness will recall it, and you'll continue to go about your business with the meditation topic dominant. And similarly, if you have medication that you need to take every day, and let's say you take it in the morning, and now it's evening, and you haven't taken it, you recall, hang on, there's something I should have done today, and I haven't, and it's that, and you remember. And you either take your medicine if you can, otherwise, tomorrow I must not forget, and you strengthen your determination like this. So through habituation to something, as soon as it's lacking, it drops away. Because of the quality of your habituation, it gets called back to mind. This now brings us to an end of a sub-outline in the chapter, and we come now to a new larger chapter, larger sub-outline. So the ethics of Bodhisattvas have three divisions. Now we come to the first of those three. There'll be a number of verses in this, training in the ethics of restraint from non-virtue.
Dini gyunji shiji ne dese dagi shingshindu sungdu parne nebarchas.
So this then is the 34th verse. From the first initial moments that my motivation is known to have a fault, at that time I, like a piece of wood, will remain still, able to restrain myself.
다 갑시를 간주 dro와이나 되어바이네 안지게 되니 갑리아 당보 소수기 셈리아 가르팅기도 스네 야 시신기 다시제 내내 템베스 전시신기 도시네 지역으로 해지었음을 dro와이나라 되어바이나라 가르치면 소수기 당보 소수기 셈라 가르팅기도 세베게 셈을 받다시 지역으로 해지래 대체 레시 당보 디디 셈시데 당보 수수 셈다 Kishimashi Nelia, Lugi Juba Maji Nelia, Samlonala, nearly Kali Dusin, Jane Shishin, Jambigi, Shishin Da, then the Jambigi Zin, Jane Shishin, that would is it. The same no Kunoy or what Gunos your what that is. The same that the same Lapsana Digruad, the same Lapsana Dini, the jelly rod is same said. That's also Samlonala, that ya. Sosu Subukar Chiji, Samonala, Samokaru Tamata says Yorua. That is the Tambo, Sosu Samonala, Samokaru with the Tahu.
The first line, from the first initial moment that my motivation. So perhaps for now, instead of motivation, we just say from the initial moment that my mind, because the meaning is that before engaging on a stream of thought, thinking about something, or doing something or saying something, just before even starting, look at your mind. So before starting, when that initial thought arises to engage in a process like thinking about something or doing something or saying something, from the moment, the first initial moment that there is a thought to do something, look at your mind.
That number so some down do that some down do that some no car code to Kuno Garce to Ligua, just some number some car code in some that do stay in the social some nalaya, Shanlia, Kunju Chege, some load to code, Kunju Cho or some load to do him do. Then again, Kunju Cho, Kunji Chan, Kunju Chege, Devil Kiana, the Hakuaja, or the Kunju Chege, some Kisha, D and the Yahumares, D and the notorious, Kisan, Shanlia, Kunju Chevena. Gunji some not corner, dig it in and jag 60 Ganama, Shanley Gunji Sigma, and Mila, and the Rana Makiba Rashin, you got a never. And dig it, Shanley Gunji 60 turn, Gunlong Koran, Shanley Gunji, Samba, Shanley Nube, Samba Kigor. The end, Dineza, dig it 60 new Shanley Neva show, just a Liang and Basa, Dinigi, and then I do Jike, Lunagi, 6 up Sunyaki, that Lunga never, 6 up this Sunyaki. 대단 송송아이들 가두도스 되네자 수림 소위기 and 무슨와 차용을 되지 디바사용을 니기에 제보 마음반에 다세달이네 라라 녀바 샤나 라진이가로 동아기야래 나는 디기 레앙한 바사이데 개와 치마이네 동아녀제 안 동아녀가 차기래 되네자 디리 되네게 삼로디 꽤나 된바래 꽤레 노트레스 다진 하고제 되네 오다디 삼디 다교 말해서 템비기 봐 송고에 샤오를 해서 디리 셈디 균제 시제네서도 균바 시제 되네 템비가 남서 오다디 진의 지교 말해서 파가고를 해서.
Looking at the first two lines, but firstly this word translated as motivation, so it's a more general word, a word for mind. The meaning is motivation because the motivation is what arises before one engages in anything. But it's really the important part in that first line is that very first impulse to do, say, or engage in some thought, that very first moment of consciousness, that needs to be investigated, which is the second line, is known to have a fault. So as soon as the impulse arises to engage in a train of thought, to do something, to say something, look at that motivation and see whether it has a fault or not. See if whether the afflictions are influencing what is about to be engaged in. And with this, one reminds oneself of the faults that follow, the suffering that follows, if one's motivation has a fault in it. That from engaging, following through with a motivation, under the influence of a motivation that has faults, in other words, afflictions, that is afflicted. From this, one creates non-virtue. From that, suffering will follow. So when the mind is influenced by the afflictions, to the extent that it is, the mind's peace is lost. Happiness is not present. Moreover, one is not only therefore suffering to an extent now, one is creating the causes for future suffering. And if this is not just merely a train of thought, but it gets expressed through physical, verbal behavior, one brings harm to others. So when we understand or when we know that there is a fault present in our motivation, we know that from this, suffering will come for myself and others, and in this life and lives to come. This then is all that is known. So it's not just as whether an affliction is present or not, but more than that, the results of acting under the influence of the afflictions.
Denige samlo da do she ji yang de denige shan lia gyun jue jie ge samlo yue ba da ane shan lia ane ji ge ke chi shan gi jia la gu ma gu de ge samlo yue ba denige ane shan lia ane chewa che ge ne ba che samlo ro chi denige yue ba che ha go na lam sa di o de samlo di no chu re de samlo di da ne lu ngang ge jue ba ane ji ge ane gu ma gu ya de shan le ne ba che ba dang lu yu ge ne shan yu gu ma gu shan lia 차와 잡아도 용거래 나이거는 전에 추수 줘봐도 주인셰파 고화다바디는 용거래 대인자데 교회에 야구 말에 선배 남사디 삼로디 당타의 노트를 녀모게게 주 현래 뇌버체게 룽하게 권에 현래 뇌비기에게 다 규차를 그래서 제사 될때는 딘베 야구 말에 제사디 제사 수림 소야다 가루고 대인자 리행한 바사 디기 안지게 제공한 바게 되네 세대다 개와치면 동안용화 차게 야고 말해야 삼지 내는 남사 되니게 삼로디 파 까고래까지 잼비게 되는 바 도시네 삼로게 맞죠 마 매가 좀 모래서다.
So the first line, from the first initial moment that my motivation or my mind, so this really shows right at the very outset, in the very first moment of the impulse arising to act, and again act physically, verbally, mentally, we need to look at our mind. And the way that it's being described, it's hopefully clear that it's not merely looking for the presence or absence of the afflictions, but this looking for the presence or absence of the afflictions is done with a clear understanding of the faults that the afflictions lead to, the harm that the afflictions lead to. Because if one merely has the understanding that there is an affliction present and I shouldn't follow the afflictions, that gives a very weak impetus for us to break this chain of action that we are about to launch into. Whereas, if there immediately is the understanding, affliction is present. From this, I will suffer now, I will cause suffering to others too, and I'm creating the causes to suffer in lives to come. That gives far greater strength and a more determined attitude to break the stream that we are about to engage in, the stream of activity that we are about to engage in. This thereby enables our ethical restraint to be successful. So this is mindfulness here at work. And mindfulness then will enable us to stay within the restraints of what is ethical.
Kena yago ma de samno digi ani di shukin teje an 지금 내가 ani 룽하기 ani 제 자왕 한바 먹고 제로 그래 제사 디 samno 주인의 거기 말에 선배실람사 도스카야다 디네게 삼다지 디지다다 군원래 용을 디멤비기 유코론래 디 가브리아 어디 빼고라 선배지 바가지하러 제아요 디나 디 슈킨 제제 안 노트 먹고 쉬어야지 자와 룽하기 자왕 한바 차려야 제거래 대한 삼는 아까벨라 어디 젠델라티 배 두자레세 배 삼는 교연 다지겐 코라시어로와 디게 삼는 쇼네 디 교연디 삼는디 슈체데 디 슈겐 토네 달룽하게 넘겨 토네 샬리아 교주제 바다 sigma와라 소바디 네네게 안지 류유거네 안 자왕한 발라 소바체야데 용고와 디네자 디네게 삼는 가르코데 제자 디네게 두 신주 제도에 삼는 안 바로 녀모제다 지게 자와 마룽보 제기 기 델레 때네 디네 용하게 삼로지 코고요바나 디 삼로도 람사 시진이 하고 있는데 잠비 어디디 하고 말해서 바까고 남사 까고 그래시 디지 디네 까요디 디네 디 삼로도 바까요디 되는 이 삼리 제수집이 류하게 줘봐 남바디 연구 말해 진짜 류하게 줘봐 샬레 뉴비 자와 연구 말 진짜다 류하게 수림 단가와디 연구 말해 진짜 수림 송투고 말해지 오라 되네서
So give an illustration, because from this illustration hopefully it'll be clear that where our attention as spiritual practitioners really needs to be is on our mind, more so than on what our mind is wanting to engage in at this point, at this stage here, from the first initial moment. In that, let's say you're watching your mind and you see the arisal of the thought arising, I like that. Now we've seen something that we like, and we see it's more than just a like, it's a desire, it's an attachment that's arisen. So here, if we are relying well on mindfulness and vigilance, we will be more aware of this arisal of attachment for what is being seen than getting caught up in this lovely thing that we have seen. Thereby, recognizing with the focus being more so on the arisal of attachment than what we see as desirous, we then can prevent our mind from getting lost in the object, but by remaining focused on the mind itself, we can our mindfulness can recall the faults of this affliction, and that including that this affliction can lead us to act in a non-virtuous way, maybe stealing this, maybe deceiving someone so that we can get it, this kind of thing. So by being focused on our mind, and more so than on the object that the mind in general is attracted to, we can recognize that affliction and counter it. This then enables our mindfulness to have the strength required for us to ethically restrain ourselves from following the mind of attachments, which may well lead to, for example, stealing something, or taking it for ourselves and not letting someone else have it, not sharing, for example. So in this way, by watching our mind, taking care of our mind, we restrain our body from accumulating non-virtue, or our speech from accumulating non-virtue, by restraining our mind well like this.
대세 다게 신신도 송투 벌네 내버자 쓰데 대세 데네게 삼롱한 바로 또 시키기와 통용도 되네 심주시 게 샘르데 데네게 녀모게 데네게 륜하기 쬐바 주림난 가이비게 진짜와 제가 군노로 삼로를 되는 영사를 선배 삼로 통용도 남사 하고와 전에 한 대세 신신도 시대 신세의 행동 전부를学问的 행동 저 차고는 하고 쉬쉬면 기면 가지다 그냥 그 따라 구겨당 그 되투어래 되투어와 제가 이거로 근데 신춘주 단전에 차초주는 나와기도 차선 신신 좀 누구로 매바 차로 되게 행동 전부되게 있는 배직을 하고로 지까지 겸나 파모요 와서 그런 따라디니 되거와 디난신 신천보동 신동 난신 전에 하바 가져에 미와 따라니 투바 난신 아주 삼로디야 아니 계획 철바 송제 대지기 녀모베 삼로 아니 지금한바 뒤쳐서 마땅하지 송제 다가랑 샘디 두신에 델마다 송제 네투바 저거래 해서 그래 되네 송투반에 내버려자 샘디바 델바 송제네 아니 바 계획 있으면 네투바디 두신 되바 저거래 해서 이가
Then Shantideva introduces the analogy, the third and fourth line. At that time, I, like a piece of wood, will remain still, able to restrain myself. So here, this term piece of wood, so the Tibetan can be translated as wood, but as a tree, it can be translated very broadly. But what should arise to one's mind, if you take a tree, is not a twig or a feeble branch that will get blown or broken, bent and maybe broken in the howling gale of the afflictions. But rather imagine a large, sturdy tree that stands strong in the face of the howling gale. This is how we need to be, unmoving, unaffected by the howling gale of the afflictions. This is how we need to be, despite this strong habituation pulling us in a direction. Merely remaining still, recognizing we have the capacity to restrain ourselves. We do not need to follow this impulse. There is no need to follow this impulse. We can restrain ourselves.
지게 마롱와 지제기 내가 연구요 봐 하고도 삼 셈다 하고요도 어디지 지대 야고요 말디디 독자래디 델레테네 제봉한 발 얘기를 했습니다. 셈디 괜히 봐 하고제 안데랑 게 셈디다 되니게 셈디기 초소 마다와제 디 초소 메요와데네 령하게 쥐어봐대야 디 초소 마조와지 두제네 셈디 송제네 근데 지금 바데 바마다 송투바세 두제네 송파 송제 셈데 개월파 내제 송제 디초서 마다와제디 자 투바이 제고레스 데네 투바이나다 고 류하기 가소레다 류하 치수 송야 준 송야 안에 마캬 송야 안에 지게 미셸레미 준시야 차사도 송야다 류하고네 안 디버 송야 되게 제 류유고네다 지거 소저바다 마진발렘발라소바다 데네 로염라소바 데네게 송야디 두세네 군노 삼로디 균 통에도 어디지는 노트디 차를 야고요 말해서 배송인데 제가 다 령하게 예주의 돈백이 돈바티 야고신이 두그리에서지 두시는 삼단제 당보전 시신대 전반나 시신기 파 심로드 간을 코드 제바체 데네겐 저 통로디 된 덴비게 남사 오다심디 지산단에 야고요 말다 심베 남사 삼로디 까지는 디 도쇼 델리아 도쇼들 바 제수 송제 도시네 네도바 제고레스 데네 지나 데네 네도바이나 룽을 쥐어바디 나는 셈 디징한베 초송 말에 송 말에스 제자 신동 침마다 제 라보 가지 겹네 그 요원에 따라니 두도 디나지 차기에서
Here we're being encouraged to be confident in our capacity, to not see ourselves as weak and vulnerable, but to recognize that we have tremendous capacity. We do not have to follow every impulse in our mind. But we need to be on guard, and from the first moment that a mind arises, wanting to push our body or in a particular direction, or our speech in a direction, look at that mind carefully and see whether the afflictions abide or not, whether there's a fault or not. And if we recognize a fault, immediately remind ourselves of the grave consequences that will follow. Do not allow oneself to be deceived by the afflictions thinking it doesn't matter. But recognize that if I follow this non-virtuous motivation, I will engage in non-virtuous physical or verbal behavior, and from that, I create causes to suffer in this and lives to come, and I bring harm to others. This is contrary to the person I want to be. Moreover, I don't have to follow every thought that arises in my mind. I have experience and skill in restraining my mind, and now too, I will remain unmoving, unswaying, like a powerful tree. And if the afflictions are strong due to habituation, visualize this. Visualize yourself as having strength, and let the afflictions go. Restrain yourself, knowing you have that capacity. And in this way, you will restrain your body from engaging in non-virtuous behavior, such as killing or stealing or sexual misconduct, and you restrain your speech from deceiving others, taking advantage of others, talking badly to or about others. In this way, one will restrain oneself ethically, restrain oneself from engaging in non-virtue.
안다 디기 저기 담보 Lunga Jawa Majun Elias, Nang Samnonale, Kaniko, Samnodi Guen, Yunden, the Guen Bahako, watching a dish Sungore, said that Jidan Mahasung Sungora. That Gerardo, that Yadelea, on the Mictane, Tatan Cordia, Dennis Tower, said Sungor, that in the one mother. De me, Yan Tawani, Namia Dagi, Michate, Never Sembe Tadoni, Mini Papte Tower Jas.
That verse was about ethical restraints. I mentioned there are 3 types of ethical restraint that we, in the section on the ethics of restraining from misdeeds. Later will come the ethically practicing virtuous qualities, and thereafter the 3rd type of ethics, ethically striving to benefit sentient beings. So that verse was about restraining one's body and speech within what's ethical by watching the mind from the first moment, by watching the mind. Now we come to advice on how to guard what we see, watching our eyes. So the 35th verse, never should I look around without purpose and distracted. Rather, with a focused mind at all times, I should look with a lowered gaze. Without purpose. Okay.
Alright, just on the mig pass of time to couple of patchy, Cascalo to stand to teaching Migle, Maseva, that Ton Lamson, or that debate. Teaching Lamson pursued the corner line, the Gunji had the Yungorua. And taking to penning to the deli, the Lamson, Chapakeda, chicken Yungora, just a Migi, my Tatanatone. Then is that Mictanadilla, ma Dustine, Tatanima Sungore.
The purpose then of restraining what our gaze is because it's through the doorway of our sight that the afflictions can get so stimulated. We see things we dislike and we get annoyed. We see things we like and our mind dwells on that. So this is why we need to restrain our sight or restrain ourselves from looking around.
Dennis, in that two Shanzanda and some on the Kartangurasine, just that meek part as we had Pachi Tarambo, Casacalatavena, Chigi, Denigi Chapaki, Zebra Thompson there, and Delia Chapaki, Benjalaina, Rakarina, the New Delibeke Chapaki, La Sopata, the Nigi Mazeba, the Nigi Thompson Delia, and the Gyundaya Konrakiata, the Nigi Yungu Ores, and Beke Denigas, Yobanza, the Nigi Sushin, Samta, then it is a Denigi. Tunda me pasu taring batayadi rangle pendo me shende pendo me batawa ne choyo mares tayaji rangda shenile pando yoba chilia pando yena andine tana digor wada rangle pendige shenle range kewi nyamna chebale penba dar jidine shenle pendo chegi indene den pando yoba ine tana jiruye dinigida pando me ba 지 파셈디 파 영제 안에 녀모바 깨와다 안에 콘로 깨기 데니기 깨 율파다나 된 야고요 말디 안에 되메 영어라 따와니스 제단 라셴 니가라 된다 판도 메디겐 안제지게 셈 영에 차당도 율파 따와디 gün에 야고요 말디 견진 셈디 숙체셔르네 차당게 샤나 차당 숙체르게 데네 디게네 안에레 류마기 쥐바다마 레응고레 셈 두시는 Sometimes Namia Dagi Mijati City, that in Namia, the Nigi, Sim Yanchi, Tunda maybe Taring Ball Park unit, like me, some big Dushin, some down warrior.
The Tibetan starts with for us in English, the second line. So without purpose or without meaning. So without purpose or without meaning, we should not have our eyes wandering around. So if there is a specific purpose to looking here or looking there, that's a different story. But rather looking around in a way that is merely just distracted, looking for something to stimulate the mind, this is not what we should be doing. We need to have our mind restrained. It doesn't need to be stimulated. We can abide as we are moving around on topics of virtue. We don't need to be looking for things to stimulate us, which is what happens. We see something we dislike, and aversion arises, and that is likely then to dominate us. We lose whatever virtuous, we distracted from whatever virtuous thing we're thinking about. Now we think about something we dislike. Or, even more likely, seeing something that appeals to us, that we like. And now our mind is drawn towards that. And this can then either lead to strong attachment arising, or thoughts going all over the show, our distraction growing. And we've long lost whatever virtuous thoughts we were rather cultivating. So therefore, we should not, without purpose, look around. If there is a purpose and there is benefit, so this word purpose can be translated as purpose, benefit, or meaning. So if there is benefit in looking around for oneself or others, then by all means do so. That is a different story. But not if there isn't. Then one should not. And then the second line in the Tibetan, our first line, never should I look around. So this is really quite explicit or very direct. That this we should walk with our mind, in order to walk around with our mind restrained, we need to restrain our senses. Here, we're talking about our sight, restraining our sight, so as to restrain our mind from the afflictions, to aid the restraining of our mind from the afflictions.
Dizana denda yobade tharing bone do sa mi ba tharing bo ta la ya ji yang ju ge ba tharing bo song shu xue na tharing bo ne ma de ni me tharing bo ne la ma de ya tharing bo da gua chai go ro du sim da go ro tharing bo ta da su su ge da de ne ge chue xue da la ma ji ya re di men bi da de ne ge to ne da yang ji tharing bo ne du sta re ni ji ge 미션을 뇌체다 비는 뭐지 공부하다 어디는 어디 도용구도다 신디 사사에다 뇌사에선 신차서 삼성 여러 다른 뭐 어디 마찬 사서서다 지금 파 저거도 좀 송급제 용으로 하다 판도 제게 되네 다른 뭐 일단은 저거로 봐 된다 여봐로 현래 판도 여봐 주야기 근데 다른 뭐 다시 현래 판도 주야지 단 지금 랑래 판도 주야지 현 다른 보다는 개와서 도야 되네 뒤도로 와다 지고래서 디면비 남면시다 차단 셈디파 인제 파 되니게 된다 하면 차단 계획 유르바 인도 다바는 난 되니게 연구로 와다 되니게 다바는 되네 디견진에 차단 숙셔져 줘도 되네 만절이 녀모보 숙셔져 되네 디왕게 릉어 줘봐야 근데 두자 차게 냐가다 빈 여러 와다 두시네 바시 연구를 제가 편히 제모를 쓰기는 제모 따진 제가 아주 유통의 된 소소 편히 바 차진 된 소소에 바줘도 바다가도 편히 줘진 남면진의 고홀에 소소 기회념는 제 바시 제 연구를 와지다 내내기 손에 어떤 남면 발이야 안도 스타기오만 제가 균에 딱이메 삼제 삼나라 두신의 삼다제 다지단 되내기 전에 샘 남면 송 지산 기회 제발 바시 지고 그랬습니다. 삼 되는 바샘 남면 왕도 마땅하지 도시네 제 남면 계획 유를 딱매 샘샘의 송고를 송지의 개발 반내고를 해서지 송고를 해서지 지게 담보니 얘기시다 됨 지산 뒤에서는 라마 송지 주어는 두스테는 라마 제요 말거든요. 두스타 오라는 빈 라마 제들 라마 송지 오라 송지 주어도 돼. 네, 제가 지금 아주 순주야지 되네. 균에마다 되냐마 지금 라마 제가 되는 두시네. 근데 뭐 누가나 취지 주어도 맨날 다들 두스미 균에마다 되는데 야 누가나 취지 가르가르 두스 고 간데 제어 된다 때는 지고를 지고 하는데. 근데 누가나 취지 신제 야 균에마 눈도 단 좋아서 되는 판다 말.
So what we have in the second line is of importance here. Without purpose and then distracted. So you determine for yourself, as we saw in the previous line, you watch your mind. In the first instance of the motivation, you see what your purpose is for looking around or not. So at times there certainly are purpose. For example, or certainly is purpose. For example, when receiving a teaching, to look at the teacher, there certainly is purpose there. It helps keep you focused. That is good to do. But if, on the other hand, one's mind is distracted and looking all over the room, clearly this doesn't aid hearing, hearing the teaching. So there is purpose to looking at the teacher, because if one's looking down, one's likely perhaps to get more distracted. So one watches one's mind, looks at the motivation, makes a determination with purpose or without purpose, and follows that. Because the whole purpose here is to guard the mind from coming under the influence of the afflictions. So making the wise decision to look or not to look. Is there purpose or not? And likewise, outside of here, if one looks in the distance to see whether the road is clear or the route is clear, or if there's some problems ahead, of course, there's purpose. But otherwise, if you go traveling around and you're looking and you're criticizing this and you're criticizing that, no purpose. Rather, bring your gaze down to return your mind to virtue. And or likewise, if you need to, in a position of responsibility, then others are relying on you. You do need to look around to make sure everything is okay, or to give suitable advice and so forth. So there's not a blanket ruling that one should always be looking down. You need to check for yourself if there's purpose or not. Because, so we have the second word, that of distraction. This is really what we want to guard against. Because when the mind is distracted, it's going to follow its general habituation, which may well be towards the afflictions. Whereas if one is watching one's mind and only looking in areas of purpose or looking around with purpose, then one's mind is not going to be distracted towards the afflictions. But if you're looking for distraction, looking for excitement, your mind is not on virtue and it's seeking attachment. Moreover, when one's not guarding one's sight well, one may see something appealing. People, doing something you have an interest in, and then you stop and you watch. And now your mind's long forgotten whatever virtue you're trying to cultivate, and now you're engaging with thoughts about, oh, isn't it interesting what they're doing, or they should rather be doing it like that. From this, really no purpose comes. So to take care of your mind, it's important to take care of what you're engaging with, and thereby restraining your sight. This makes a big difference.
Dine za do chine samdanji de ngebar sembe ta do ni mini phapde tawar cha se dine ge da semgi ngebar do semgi da dine ge nami yang yul pha ta gi me sembe samdanji semdi ge all pha sha chine dine mini phapdo tawar cha se mi ti nga pha ta du chu pa draw ina do steven da de ya so su gi dün ya dom gangs ma do pha dine ta ya ma re so da dom ga do chin ma da 디스마다 다치고서 되니스다 그래서 그래. 된 조베나 두시네 단도 조 그래서 그래. 되는 되베나 되니스다지 두시네. 되어 그래서지. 다다 미다나 되니시 그래. 되는 거 샤나 되베나 두시네. 다제 기운 마 가제가 다다 메서로 됐단 머니가 남이야 차로로 하다. 가브리엘이야 아니지기 자로지 슈크시에 되게 제 총알 봐. 지 투제던 어떻게 독자 자디사드 남자 제 제들로 콘라야지 용구로 되니게 되니게 제가 되네자 두시네. 딱 예버도 셈기 유 남명께 남명을 쳐서 마다와 셈이 봐 송제 미티 남명을 쳐 땅 미티가 제가 딱이메 셈비게 셈디 송제 셈기 봐 송예버도 셈디 송제 되는 봐다야 될이야. domgang chunchil ma do dele pa ye chine da gyo ma re se do chim sung or da.
With an understanding that with the purpose of this life is to cultivate virtuous qualities within our mind, we need to limit the mind's distraction. Therefore, we ensure that we keep our mind focused. So the third and fourth line, rather with a focused mind at all times, I should look with a lowered gaze. So this is both when one is moving around, when walking and so forth, or sitting, stationary or moving. One should abide with a lowered gaze, for the simple reason not to have one's mind distracted. So even when you're in your home and you're in your room, maybe just reading or reading and so forth, if one hears a sound and immediately is drawn to it, like this, the mind is distracted. Or stand by, you hear some birds and you go to the window and you have a look, And then you notice one chasing the other. And then thoughts come about, look, why can't they live in harmony? And you get annoyed with the birds. From this, no purpose comes other than losing the virtuous minds that you're trying to cultivate. So, as it says, rather with a focused mind at all times, I should look with a lowered gaze.
And the nigga some of the part of Namsa or the Yapo Mardi, dinner, the Gun, Chisan Delitine, Rajin, Yala Kanga, Yumuri, SMP, some Dajan, dinner some Ma, Lamsan Gajin, Lunga, Joba, the teacher, Matawaji, and Sem the Kewala native by Chegores, Dosine, Nikitina, Dosina, some Dangores, and the Gedina, that Dosina to draw to Dubacanina, some meat bag, Gisem. Ransheniga la Pando me by Dunda Medic and Chilia, Nami want to song in the bar to Chalanki, Yulpa, meet as a Galadusina, like your Mares, the negate unit tag me, Titawa in it, that Chalan you and Nam Chalanki, you tons and then Chawakia, and Dawakia, the younger days, I think, Saugin tag me, and some Dajin, the Nessim, Modusin, Kewale, give you some Lata, the negate, and the meet the park, Chick Papche, Jiki Domgan, Sunchemat, Dushin Dane, Dushin, Getina, the Nation Yamla Chegores, at the Nature Veneta, as you Lunga Kim, Jabangamba, Net Jike Domba, Dokshoke, Kawati, Yumares, Suntubures, Urda.
So these two verses that we've now looked at, or the three, these, the second and third, these are about the ethics of restraint from non-virtuous, from faulty behavior, non-virtuous behavior. So these two really are about restraining one's non-virtuous speech, restraining from non-virtuous speech, restraining from non-virtuous behavior. And in these two verses, we've been given guidance on how to do that. In the first verse, the first of these two verses, we saw the need to look at the motivation immediately when a motivation arises. And what we are looking for is if there is the fault of the afflictions present or not. So before we follow this thought to do or say something, immediately investigate that motivation and see if it is free of the afflictions or not. And if it is, remind yourself of the faults of the afflictions, the faults that come to you and others now and in lives to come. And then remain still. Keep your mind still, not following that afflicted motivation. Remind yourself that you have strength. You do not need to follow every thought. In this way, one keeps one's mind still. And likewise, when one is, then secondly, in terms of one's sight, whether sitting or moving around, keep your gaze lowered. And in this way, one aids the guarding of the visual doorway to the mind, guarding the mind from becoming overly stimulated and distracted by seeing things. So rather, lower one's gaze. And in this way, one is going to be, this aids one, guard the mind, and thereby one's physical and verbal behavior.
That Yamle Yago Nanganzo may pay Yago Nanganzo Dinishi Jik Wada. Nanganzo de Yuna Pasu to the Mick Park at Galatan Energy. Gina, the Ophi do a Jik do ye do it, Kambo Yabo do Chichi do that show.
And if you've been in the presence of accomplished practitioners, this is how they are. Their minds are still, and therefore their bodies is still. They're not looking around. If you're traveling with them, they are just looking down here. They're not getting caught up in what's going on around them because their minds are still abiding with virtue.
Yeah, that is yes, and then Jema Delia Paso Tao said,
So then we can conclude there for tonight. But next week, as you can see from the next verse, then we see that, well, it's not at all times one has to look down. There are times when it's certainly good to look up and look around. Because the truth is, if one is always looking down, one is likely to become really narrow-minded and tight and uptight. So we need to be balanced in this and in all instances. Then thank you. Thank you, Steve.